Hi, Isaac.
Rabbi, good morning.
Good morning. I hope
So
it's
good to see you.
yeah. This is it's been a long hiatus for us.
Yes, it is.
Time we've read it.
And can you believe it or not? We are still halfway through Matthew 5, which just seems like we've been in this for a really long time.
I do believe it. I'm starting to think that we're spending as much time on this as it took Jesus himself to write this. I always sometimes think about that. Was there like a process of behind the scenes taking notes, trying to figure out the sermons? Did they come natural? Because some people could just speak sermons naturally and have their ideas either from John the Baptist or just in general very clearly, and they flow out of you. You can articulate your ideas without any deeper thoughts or comprehension that you need to like reflect. So it's really interesting when you think about how the behind the scenes, what was taking place, how did the housekeeping takes place for these things.
Well, yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's it's quite a bit of mystery involved in that. In fact, I've been thinking the exact on a similar line where did his teachings evolve or did his thinking evolve over time? Or were these sermons a one-time thing? And I grapple with that. Did he, we discussed he called these three men, come, follow me, I'll make you fishers of men. They follow him, and then by then, did he have a fully working theology of what this is, or has it evolved over time? And most people have evolved. If it's evolved over time, what was the progression like? Like, did his first words just say, you're the salt of the earth, or did that progress over time, which then shows how it'll probably give more context into his humanity, because some of these words are so kind of difficult to follow, difficult to understand, difficult to kind of I get the thing. It's the ideal, but the lived experience is so different, and so um, any insight into how his thinking's evolved would have been that's something I've been thinking about.
Right, and this is true. This is not a Christian question.
Yeah.
This is a religion question. The easiest example is when you look at the Quran and you look at Islam. It's so clear that there's certain contradictory ideas that this was earlier Muhammad, this is later Muhammad, and even with those very clear examples of certain aspects of how to treat people in the military and etc. You'll see that people will say, oh, it's really the same ideology, because when you're dealing with a holy text, you're kind of stuck. Why would the ideology of a person that is evolving over time, why would the holy text record the earlier ideology what the person himself, in this case, I guess Muhammad, rejected? So if Jesus is this evolving character, unless we want to follow how he is growing and evolving, and the revolutionary effort from birth to death, and how the character changed, it's difficult why our holy text would record this. It definitely underlies the whole question of what is a contradiction. When we have the text, as we know in the synoptics, giving different versions of the same story, is that a contradiction? Is it something we have to deal with? Is it something we have to answer up? Because some people will say, that when the 10 commandments are given twice in Exodus and Deuteronomy, and they have different words, and it's one thing to say the 10 commandments were written twice. It's another thing to say like what God spoke on a mountain. So what do you do with these contradictions? And this is definitely one of the work of religious scholars to try to figure out when to say the earlier thing is now heresy. Like we don't believe that anymore, and when the later ideas became formal canonical ideas. Anyways, it's a good question. The Sermon on the Mount and
So
the five.
so it sounds like you're saying in this case his teachings didn't evolve, because if they were evolved over time, then it becomes heresy, or there'll be contradictions, and then it becomes heresy, because which one do you take? But at least reading these four gospels, the synoptic gospels, it's not so much a contradiction per se, but they probably speak of this different perspectives. Some are more clear, some aren't clear, but none of them speak into was it a progression of thought, or what was this
Yeah,
progression?
where I think one of the places that we see this, I think, most starkly is with Abraham. Abraham, according to rabbinic tradition, went through 10 tests, and one of the goals of a test is the goal of a test could be to gauge how much knowledge you have. But generally, if you're going through like military tests or life tests, it's in order to make you grow from the test. So the attitudes that Abraham had in the beginning of Genesis, where he's first speaking to God, where he's God's coming to him, the three angels are coming to tent. I don't think represent the same values that he experienced when the binding of Isaac took place. And a lot of rabbinic text doesn't differentiate. They say Abraham the beginning, Abraham the end, learn from anything. But I think the things that we learn from the beginning may not be the best lesson. And I'll give you one example because I think you'll find this interesting. There's when the angels come and visit Abraham, rabbinic text says he was actually with God. God appeared to him, and then God disappeared. So Abraham could go and handle the three and cater to the needs of the three angels, who he thought probably maybe were men at that time. So we learn from that it's more important to cater to the needs of your guests than to relish or bask in the divine spirit.
Yeah, this is typical Rabbi Sachs. What you just said, what you just summarized is a sermon from Rabbi Sachs.
This is like a very super famous Talmudic
Yeah.
text and Rashi text. So the question is it that Abraham had that attitude towards peoplehood and service to humans because he was missing the mark? Because this is the beginning of his journey, and by the time he gets to the binding of Isaac, what's the main point? Kill the people, they don't matter, the God's message. So you can either learn those as confirming each other, that this is the way to execute God's will, or you can learn them as contradictory. This is the way to execute people because it is God's will.
Interesting. Yeah, lots to think
this
about.
Actually flows into some of our conversation. We'll read the verse in 1 second, but I think as we read the verse 5:27, I think one thing we have to kind of keep in mind, and I'd love to discuss today, is what is Jesus trying to accomplish different than what already existed? If Jesus viewed himself as the father of a religion, which, let's just say he did, who cares? So if he viewed himself as a father of religion, and not the father that is creating ex nihilo from scratch, but the father that is really forming a schism to either pull everyone along with him or break off a piece, who knows how it was intended, what is he really accomplishing by saying these antitheses?
That's a great, that's a great question. But I would put forth to you, right, the assumption or the premise of your question, if Jesus was founding a religion, at least from what we read in Matthew so far, Jesus was not trying to found a religion. He was primarily working only within Judaism, and he was working within the faith at that time. So then the question becomes, what's his intention? Or I think we have to first at least explain, or at least when we use the term that was he trying to found religion, found a religion? Is that even a proper question?
I use the word schism more, maybe not found, but again, he's definitely coming to fulfill the law, where that means he's definitely coming to be the Messiah of this religion. That being said, there are fundamental differences that he's trying to impress upon the people, namely these antitheses. Yeah. What you did in the past is no longer what I want you to do in the future. So even if you want to say he's coming to fulfill the law has to amalgamate, it has to evolve, it has to change from what it once was. Okay, let's read the verse before we get into 20 minutes of conversation.
The Gospel according to Matthew chapter 5, verse 27. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart.
Oh, look at these. You got powerful eyes there. So Isaac, so we can put it. I just want to put aside the question of why in 5:21 it talks about the ancient ones, because we already discussed why it says the ancient ones over there, and you could apply it here or not. But I guess the opening question, Isaac, is tell me what lust is. What does the word lust mean, Isaac?
It's a profound question. It's
not meant to be. It's meant to be a very simple question.
Yeah, I mean, so lust in this context, I mean, he's probably referring to this in the context of sexual intent. But lust could mean anything. I can lust for money, or desire for something which doesn't belong to one person, or desire something, lust for the car. It's
so okay, you're pointing out that it has a dual role. The word lust, I don't use the word I lust for a new computer, but if I did say that as a sentence, you would know what I mean.
Yeah.
So you're saying that the word lust doesn't necessarily mean for sexual desire. So if you're not going to tell me a synonym for lust, then what would it mean? It doesn't mean
so. Yeah, so lust could apply to sexual desire, but it also, it could probably mean wanting something which doesn't rightfully belong to me, or which I'm not, something to which doesn't belong to me. Like if you had something and I'm jealous of that, one is jealous of that, then they will lust for that, and that wanting something which is not in their realm
Yeah,
doesn't belong to them.
I'm not here to argue with you, because I think that is actually a perfectly good definition.
Yeah.
In Hebrew, there's a very big difference between want versus lust. The word lust probably has, in Hebrew, means a strong desire. That's what. So you're actually pointing out a really much more refined definition. You're saying it's not only a strong desire; it's a strong desire for something that maybe doesn't belong to you yet. It's interesting. I'm not here saying this to contradict what you said, but we do have certain verses. For example, we have God desires. Again, you use the word lust. In Hebrew, it would be a root word of aleph vav he. So God desires Zion as a dwelling place. So in that sense, I would say that's Psalms 132:13. I'd say over there, the desire or the lust would be specifically focus on a really, really, really wants, a strong want. We also have in Job 23:13, where God acts as God desires. And again, it means as strongly wants. So over here, though, it does seem to mean, as you're saying, just like we're following murder, now we're using adultery, it does seem to be that it's a strong want. What's interesting over here is that we're using another super common emotion. What are the most common emotions people have that are bad? You have jealousy. We go through the 7 deadly sins, but like I'd say lust and or hate / jealousy are the top 2. So it's really interesting that as we go through the 10 commandments, this being number 6 and 7, don't murder, don't commit adultery, we also have like these very strong human emotions that Jesus is trying to, I think, either augment or reject. And we talked about this earlier. Thank you, Jesus. I should not lust. Now what? I mean, thank you, Jesus. I should not hate. Now what? This is not something you could really prescribe, let alone proscribe people to do. And it's really interesting that this definitely fits into the model of supererogation that we said earlier, that it's not clear to me if these are real, if these are things that Jesus is actually trying to say that it's meant to be executed this way, or these are things that he's saying that this is how the robot human being would work. A person who's perfectly functioning in a way that's perfectly connected to God. Nothing that you're ever going to get there. Isaac, don't even think about it. You're a million miles away. Russ, you can't do it. But if you want to know how it works, the robot human that I'm imagining that loves God perfectly, that doesn't lust for human anger, this is how he does it. Again, the practicality of these commandments is, or the pragmatism is something that I reflect upon, trying to think like, does he really mean this? Okay, so it's a good question. So I figured like obviously lust and this, there's a really good rabbinic parallel, because obviously lust, sexual immorality is obviously a topic that any good religion is going to talk about once at a time, just to keep people's attention. So I got some good quotes, and I thought the topic of schism versus fulfillment versus new religion versus not really falls into this as another example where we see rabbinic Judaism or Pharisaic Judaism took a different approach. Jesus always goes to nth degree. This is what we're seeing. He says, you think you got to do this? The Bible says this? You got it 10 times. So I'll give you a couple examples. So the 2 I thought were really good. We have sinful thoughts are more difficult than, or more bad than the sin itself. It says in Gemara Yoma 29a. So I think this is not what Jesus is saying here. He's saying not only is a sin bad, but this is something that I would also call a sin. So I would say the rabbis maybe go a little bit farther than even Jesus on this, is saying, you think it's only a sin to do adultery. Jesus is saying it's a sin, to actually have you lustful. And they're saying the sin of lust is worse. So again, like you have these gradations. So again, like I viewed every time I read this as hyperbole. It's hyperbolic in that from the rabbinic perspective, it's saying like, no one thinks the sins are worse. The sins are worse when you're thinking about it. But a good attitude that one should have in life when you're living is like, if you're raping or doing adultery, you're done. Like, it's not a conversation piece. But the thing that 99.9% of the population struggles with is the lustful sin. So I'm going to try to encourage you by saying that's the most forbidden thing, even though
well, that's thank you for the background. Let me put this back to you. Was Jesus onto something deeper about human psychology? So what we've known is that we have very powerful imaginations. once we decide to do something in our head, we do it. People do it all the time, and I think this has been proven by science time and again and again and again, where there's a very small gap, a very small gap between the moment we are aware of something and the time we do something, and that's willpower, or again, people, it's called different terms, but the point being, if you imagine something, think something, most likely than not, you end up doing it. And so in putting these words, was he speaking to something deep about human psychology, as in setting safeguards, as in just don't think because you aren't physically doing something you're okay, because the moment you've accepted something in your mind that it's okay, you will probably end up doing it, if not today, later down the road. And so this is meant to be a safeguard to protect, or to have, when I mean safeguard, not as a commandment, but as in
Yeah,
guardrails, the guardrails, try to say, be mindful of what you think in your head, be mindful of what you're thinking, because there's also in a context where public perception was high, right? He's, because in the earlier verse he spoke about, for I tell you, unless you righteous exceed the Pharisees and the scribes, you shall never enter the kingdom of heaven. That meaning that when we study where it has to go above and beyond. Again, it has to go, for the exact term you use, it has to go above and beyond maintaining the law, which is all good, but you also have to go beyond all that. So he's saying, if you maintain the law, but if up in your head you aren't thinking properly, then
well,
it's
yeah.
not.
So I think what you're echoing the robot human perspective, and I think there's what I would call a maximalist and minimalist read of these texts. A maximalist read is he's telling you a new prescription of life, and that's how you should live your life. If you have a lustful thought or a hateful thought, you're failing as a Christian. End of story. That's one read. And a minimalist read is what I think you're describing right now. Is like, listen, the reality is you're going to have hateful thoughts, you're going to have jealous thoughts, you're going to have adulterous thoughts, you're going to have lustful thoughts. You're human. I want to encourage you to kind of drop it down a notch, because that's how you live a good life. And that's what how I'm saying the rabbis did it in Gemara Yuma, when it says simple thoughts are worse than the sin itself. That's what I'm saying. I think it's meant to be encouragement. So again, that'd be again minimalist read. Okay, well, going back to the rabbis, I think either if we're taking the maximalist read of the Christian text saying this is how you live your life, I think the rabbis have a very different attitude. And I think there's a really interesting Gemara, and this is the one I think shows up the most in practical lives. I think you'll like it, and maybe it'll apply to you. We'll see. In Tractate Kiddushin on 29b, it says, if one has before him the commandment, the study Torah, to learn, which one always has, and you have the commandment to marry a wife. So in Judaism, when you turn 13, you have to start doing commandments. But the rabbis always recognize like 13-year-old is they always said 18 or 20 is like the real, like you're really held accountable for your sins.
Mm-hmm.
So, but let's say you're 20, you're not married. So now you have two equal commandments. You have to get married, you have to start a family, and number two, you have to learn Torah. They're both 24/7 commandments, it seems to me. If you have a wife, it might be more than 24/7, who knows? But if he cannot live without a wife, let's say at a point he feels that, and what does that mean? He can't live without a wife. It doesn't mean he needs someone to help him, his emotional stability. It means he has lust. If he has lust, he should first marry and then study, because he won't be able to study otherwise. You literally won't be able to concentrate. Rabbi Yehuda said in Shmuel's name, the halacha is a man first marries and then studies. Rabbi Yochanan said, with a millstone around his neck shall one study, namely your wife is a burden, like a millstone you're carrying around, because you have to support your family, you have to be emotionally there, you have to go take care of it. It's a whole burden. And when you have a burden, it's harder for humanity, any person, a man or woman, to kind of live a married life, because you're now taking care of another person. So make sure to study as much as possible. And you see this is the model that America takes. A lot of my wife's grandparents and great-grandparents, they got married at 13, 14, 15. That was just common, because that's when you hit adulthood. That's when your biology says get married. But America now says the average age, I have to take a guess, probably 28. But even the Orthodox world, it's probably somewhere like 22, 23, because his idea is that you go to college first. And why do you go to college first? Because having someone on you is like a millstone. You can't support you can drop out of college. That's the idea. If you get married at 18, you have to drop out of college probably, because you have to support someone. You might have a kid at 19. So you have to do a role. So what the rabbis are saying, which I think is really applicable here, is that you have lust. Jesus says you have lust. The rabbis say you have lust. And now there's two attitudes that one can take. Jesus says, stop it. Don't have lust. Not right. And next verses, we're going to see, I assume, the metaphorical attitudes toward it, but definitely very negative attitudes towards the body. If you have lust, destroy your body, break yourself apart, recreate yourself. But the rabbis say if you have lust, there's an argument. If you have lust, get married. Take out your lust in a way that's permissible. It's a very, very different attitude. If there's a way to use one of your bad character traits for good, you have lust, you want to have a lot of sex, go get married and have kids. That's how the world works. That'd be the best thing you could do. Go and do that. And what happens if you can't learn Torah? The most important thing in the rabbi's eyes is learn, study. And what happens if you can't learn Torah because you have lust? Go get married, have sex, and again, take 10 minutes, have sex, and then go and just go learn Torah.
But I would, I think Christianity takes the, I think
it's opposite of this. I think it's opposite interpretations. They both view the sin of lusting as horrible, but one uses it with the human psychology, and one says, which I think Jesus does all the time, he denies the human psychology. He says, you can't live a life like that anymore. I'm Messiah. I'm coming to change the world. And if you hate, that's unacceptable. If you lust, that's unacceptable. And again, this might be a minimalist attitude, like you're saying, just occurring, but from the maximalist perspective, where it's saying Jesus says you can't do stuff anymore, he's saying the kingdom of heaven is hard to get to, and you have to live a different life.
Okay, so, well, that's a lot. That's a lot to unpack in that. So let's leave what the rabbi said. Let's table that for a moment, because that also calls into question the view of women. Is marriage just meant to be a way for a person to take on?
We're not talking about the women's side right now.
I know. Okay, yeah. So, but on this topic of this, right, we're looking at this verse when he says that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent.
So Jesus is also coming from the male perspective, though, right? He doesn't say when a person feels lust. He says when a man looks at a woman with lust.
Yeah.
So again, same perspective.
So yeah, it's probably reflective of the patriarchal assumptions at that time, where women were probably held in higher esteem than women.
And if they even had lust for women at that time. If, like, we see in later texts that they start recognizing sexual desire for women. But in Jesus, I'm just saying, I'm not here to question or to interpret the patriarchy, but I will say the rabbinic attitude and the Jesus attitude are the same. Man lusting towards women.
Yeah. So I think so, and I can see why, because in those days, at least in that time, men had the dominant power, or women were not held in high esteem, or women didn't have the same power as men had. And this is the exact same discussion in America still today. Do women get paid the same level as men? So, okay, in terms of analogy, but there probably men were people of power. They could do in some ways what they wanted and get by with it. And so Jesus was in a way saying to them, you might have power and you might think you can do all this, but the kingdom of heaven is deeper. It's not as in, it does not, again, you have to exhibit more than, or you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven by living a double life. Maybe if you have something up the head, and that's.
He had adultery already. It's not only about the sin, it's about the attitude. Again, like I don't see anything about I don't see, you can read the feminist read or the patriarchy into anything. But for me, this is not about men. This is not about lust or men or women. It's about him taking the super arrogant attitude of that the past was not good enough. Whatever was commanded at Mount Sinai to Moses was the minimum. And I'm telling you, the kingdom of heaven is a different life.
I think that's true, but I think that's well put, right? It's more with the commandment given by Moses at Mount Sinai is minimal, and the kingdom of heaven requires a higher attitude or a higher dedication, obedience, and from that framework, from that view, I look at this as a call to live a different life. That if love, again, and we haven't discussed it so far, the call to love your neighbor, but what surprised me was Moses this, right? When we discussed anger, we said where he starts with the social gospel. He starts with the 6 verses of the commandment, as in don't get angry. He left out the first 3 or 4 of the 10 commandments, and this in some ways amplifies his message, as in we start with anger and then we go with lust. Both of these are not sins in isolation. They're sins we commit to, we do against somebody or directed towards somebody else. So from a big picture, was he pointing to the centrality or the importance of maintaining human relationships? Now this goes in similar themes to the earlier verse we discussed, where be reconciled with your brother. And we discussed how the lived human experience and what this commandment calls is so different. Like, I cannot control what everybody thinks about me. And if people have these, negative thoughts about me, feel hurt about me, this is my duty to go apologize to everyone. And so that's a big gap between human, like the lived experience and his commandment. And so this next section amplifying that message and pointing to the centrality of maintaining positive, friendly, positive relationships with fellow human beings.
So I agree with everything you're saying, but in this case, he's not really focused on. You're kind of saying like, let's focus on the bilateral relations with human beings. But this one is more inwardly focused. I would say this is more an introspective law. This is something where, just like hatred, no one really knows what's happening in your heart. Mm-hmm. And I think he's telling you that it's not about your outward relationships. It's not about how you're talking to someone. You might talk really nicely. You might never commit adultery. But I'm also worried. I'm telling you that if you do this, you already committed adultery of her in your heart. Yeah. You're already there, because your your introspective inner thoughts is what matters. So
Rabbi, let me put this to you this way. I'm still thinking about Reka. The verse we discussed a few weeks ago, Reka, right? So does one have to verbally say use the word Reka, or is it as bad if somebody mentally in one's mind accepts the other person as Reka? Like, does one verbally have to say this word to say it's bad, or just accepting this in their head? But maybe they don't verbally say this, but mentally accepting that. Isn't that the same thing as verbally saying that?
Yes, sure.
So, okay,
sure.
Yeah, so I'm probably coming into some of that same perspective where Reka is such that's a very powerful term. It's a very powerful concept for what the one we discussed a few weeks ago. And so, again, the commandment, if you were to read this literally, it seems impossible, as in you don't look at anyone with lustful intent. That is so far away from the lived human experience. In fact, they've done all kinds of science experiments to show that people think lustful thoughts all the time. It does not matter who, all the time. Correct. Right? And in fact, men in particular, right?
I wouldn't know. I just believe it, but yeah, you say so.
Men in particular. And so I look at this as, is this his call of, is this his, he sets a high bar as a way to motivate people to at least try to attempt to live a higher life, or to live a different life, and not just live to one's instincts, or the basic human instincts.
I hear.
Okay. I mean, lust is a very powerful motivator. Nobody can deny that. I mean, once it lust doesn't, it's not a powerful motivator. They don't know what they're talking about. And so is he saying, don't just live to your human instinct, to your animal instincts, the human instincts, but a call to attempt to live to a higher life?
Again, it's really interesting. Just to finish, the rabbinic text says, if the disgusting one, namely lust, has encountered you, drag that person to the study hall. So they view the study as the remedy. And again, it's just an interesting difference. Okay, Isaac.
It's a question of what gets your attention. I think I'm reminded of a quote I read yesterday, where attention is the purest form of generosity. And so what people think about, what gets your attention, is what gets them. And so if one is caught up in the world of Torah study, then that's probably what shapes them. Anyway, lots to think about. Thank you for this conversation. Have a great Shabbos, and talk to you soon.
Yeah.